I didn't go looking for a legend. The place came up the way these things often do, not in stories meant to scare, but in conversations meant to end quickly. A county official in North Carolina mentioned it while explaining why a particular patch of land had never been developed. He didn't name it at first. He just said nothing stays there overnight. No tracks, no tents, no animals. He said it the way someone explains a zoning issue, not a mystery. Only later did I see it on a map, a small, roughly circular clearing tucked into dense woodland, bordered by pine and scrub oak. From above, it looks unimpressive, a pale mark where vegetation should be. On the ground, it feels unfinished, like the land is waiting for something to move on. Local records go back nearly 200 years. They don't agree on causes, but they agree on outcomes. Crops planted inside the circle failed, fence posts placed there leaned and fell. Dogs refused to cross it, even when called. People tried to test it early on. They drove stakes into the soil and checked them in the morning. They camped nearby and watched through the night. They marked the perimeter carefully, convinced that daylight would explain what darkness seemed to erase. It never did. I arrived in the late afternoon, when the light still felt neutral. The clearing was smaller than I expected, maybe 40 feet across and completely bare. The earth wasn't scorched. It wasn't cracked. It simply refused growth, as if the idea of remaining still had been rejected long ago. I stepped to the edge and stopped, not out of fear, out of instinct, because everything around the circle felt settled. Insects, birds, the slow movement of wind through trees. Inside it, there was no sound at all, not silence exactly, more like motion had been removed from the equation. I hadn't crossed it yet, but standing there, I already understood why people didn't stay. The ground didn't feel hostile. It felt busy. The first thing I noticed after crossing the boundary was how quickly my sense of time flattened, not slowed, erased. There was no internal marker to measure how long I stood there. My watch still moved, the sun still lowered behind the trees, but the usual signals that tell you this moment is passing were absent. That detail shows up again and again in early accounts. Farmers described stepping into the clearing to retrieve tools and coming out unsure how long they'd been gone. Surveyors complained their notes didn't line up with their own memory of movement. One man wrote that he felt as though the ground had no patience for standing. Nothing placed inside the circle stayed upright for long, not because it was pushed or disturbed, but because it couldn't find balance. Objects leaned, shifted, collapsed, slowly, almost politely, as if the soil were rearranging itself beneath them, refusing to support anything that implied rest. I knelt and pressed my palm into the dirt. It wasn't loose. It wasn't wet. It wasn't unstable. It simply didn't feel finished. I stood again and walked the diameter, heel to toe, measuring it with tools. The ground resisted rhythm. My steps never settled into a comfortable pace. Each football felt fractionally out of sync with the last, forcing constant correction. This wasn't a place that rejected presence. It rejected permanence. That distinction matters. Animals sense it immediately. Horses thrown into the circle as a test in the 1800s bolted within minutes, eyes wild, hooves skidding as if the ground moved beneath them. Even now, locals say deer skirt the perimeter carefully, crossing the woods without ever cutting through the open center. I became aware of something else then. Not a sound, not a shape, but effort. The faint, continuous suggestion that something was moving without ever arriving. The land wasn't empty. It was occupied by motion itself, and standing there, Adjusting my footing again and again, I understood why nothing survives the night here. Because night is when movement has nowhere else to go. I didn't intend to stay until dark. That was the plan. Observe, document, leave before the light shifted enough to change the character of the place. But the clearing doesn't respect intention. It thins it out, stretches it, until the seasons lose their edges. The sun dropped faster than I expected. Shadows from the surrounding trees slid inward, stopping cleanly at the circle's edge, as if something invisible held them back. Inside, the ground remained evenly lit for a few moments longer, wrong in a way that made my stomach tighten. Light behaved differently here. It didn't settle. It hovered. I stepped back to the perimeter. The forest behind me sounded normal. Crickets, wind, the distant snap of a branch. Inside the circle, none of it followed. Sound entered and then died, like breath held too long. That was when I noticed the marks. They weren't footprints. They didn't have direction. Shallow disturbances in the dirt, oval and overlapping, as if something had paced it tight, repeating arcs, not large, not heavy, persistent. The ground had been buried into the shape. Local stories say nothing rests here overnight. They don't say nothing walks. I felt it then, the pressure to keep moving, not panic, not fear, compulsion. My body shifted its weight on its own, correcting again and again, like standing on the deck of a ship that never quite stabilizes. When darkness finally crossed the boundary, it didn't arrive all at once. It circled. The edge of the clearing grew indistinct, tree line blurring into a dark ring that felt closer than it was. I had the sudden, irrational certainty that if I stood still long enough, the ground would begin to instruct me, that it would show me how to move and expect me to comply. My chest tightened. This wasn't a place you endured. It was a place that practiced, and night was when the lesson began. Once night settled fully around the clearing, the difference between inside and outside became impossible to ignore. Beyond the perimeter, the forest resumed its ordinary rhythm. Insects adjusted to cooling air. Leaves shifted. Somewhere far off, an animal moved with purpose. Life reorganized itself the way it always does when daylight disappears. Inside the circle, nothing reorganized. The dirt beneath my boots felt subtly alive, not warm, not vibrating, but responsive. Every shift of my weight was answered with a minute adjustment, as though the ground were redistributing itself just enough to deny my balance. Standing still became effort. Remaining upright required attention. I tried planting my feet wide. The sensation worsened. That's when I realized the mistake people make when they test this place. They try to occupy it. They stand, they sit, they wait. Every instinct says endurance is the challenge. It isn't. Endurance implies rest between moments. The clearing allows none. I began to pace, not by choice, but because movement reduced the pressure slightly. As long as I kept moving, the ground seemed less insistent. My steps fell into a loose, uneasy rhythm, not a walk, not quite a circle, but a continuous correction that never resolved. Then the sound started, not footsteps, breathing, low, slow, not close enough to locate, not distant enough to dismiss. It didn't synchronize with my own breath, but it responded to it. When I inhaled sharply, it paused. When I slowed, it slowed. I stopped. The breathing did not. The marks I'd noticed earlier began to make sense then. This wasn't pacing born of confusion. It was repetition, practice. a pattern worn into the ground by something that never ended to leave. My light caught the dirt at a shallow angle, and I saw how uneven it truly was, not randomly disturbed, but worked, as if something had spent countless nights adjusting itself here, learning the exact limits of the circle, memorizing its edges by motion alone. I felt the overwhelming urge to mirror it, to move the way it moved. That impulse scared me more than the sound ever could have, because it wasn't imposed, it was offered. The suggestion that if I followed the rhythm, if I gave up trying to stand, to rest, to resist, the ground would stop fighting me. That's when I understood why nothing stays here overnight. Not because it's destroyed, because by morning it no longer knows how to stop. By the time I realized how long I'd been moving, my legs had begun to ache in a dull, distant way that felt unrelated to effort. It wasn't exhaustion, it was disorientation, the strain that comes from never quite finishing a motion, from correcting instead of completing. The circle does not allow closure. Every path I traced curved back into itself, not sharply, subtly, enough that I never reached a point where I could say, here is the edge, here is the center. The ground blurred those distinctions. I understood then why earlier witnesses described the space as unfinished. It wasn't incomplete, it was continuous. The breathing grew clearer. Still no direction, still no source. It surrounded rather than approached, filling the clearing the way humidity fills air, evenly, inescapably. When I slowed, it thickened. When I sped up, it stretched thinner, as if matching effort rather than distance. I tried to count my steps. I lost count twice. Not because I forgot the numbers, but because the rhythm refused to hold. My feet landed just out of sync with expectation. The left step always came a fraction too early or too late. My body began to compensate automatically, tightening muscles I hadn't consciously engaged. That was when I noticed my shadow. It wasn't wrong in shape, it was wrong in behavior. It lagged, not behind me, but to the side, drifting slightly inward as though it belonged to a different light source entirely. When I turned it hesitated, then followed, correcting itself the way I was correcting my balance. I stopped again. The ground pressed back. A pressure built in my calves, in my lower spine, urging motion, not violently, patiently. The same way hunger or thirst urges action, not as a threat, but as a requirement. I remembered a local account then, one I'd dismissed earlier as metaphor. A man had written that the clearing teaches you how to walk without going anywhere. Standing there, muscles trembling from restraint, I understood what he meant. This place doesn't chase you, it trains you, and the longer you remain, the less certain you become that leaving is the correct response. I don't remember deciding to move again. One moment I was resisting the pressure, standing still out of stubbornness more than strategy, and the next my body had shifted forward on its own. The first step felt borrowed, like a movement initiated elsewhere and routed through me as a convenience. That was the moment the fear finally arrived, not panic, recognition. Because whatever governed this place had stopped reacting to me and started accounting for me. My path narrowed without my choosing it, each step angled slightly inward, curving my movement into a tighter loop. When I tried to widen my stride, the ground rose imperceptibly beneath one foot and dipped beneath the other, forcing correction. It was subtle enough to deny proof, effective enough to remove choice. The breathing changed. It was closer now, not louder, clearer. I could hear texture in it, the faint irregularity of something that had learned this rhythm over a long time. It no longer paused when I paused. It continued, steady, practiced, as if demonstrating. I realized then that the clearing doesn't just refuse rest, it refuses deviation. Anything that enters is expected to adopt the pattern already in motion. That's why animals panic. That's why objects topple. That's why human endurance fails, because endurance assumes a goal. Here, there is only continuation. My muscles began to burn, not from exertion, but from constant micro-adjustment. There was no full step, no clear transfer of weight. Every movement was a compromise. I began to sweat despite the cold air, breathe coming shorter, chest tight with the effort of remaining my own. The worst part was the temptation. If I relaxed, if I let the ground finish my steps, the strain would stop. I could feel it. The promise of ease offered in fractions. All I had to do was match the motion fully, to let my stride become identical to the one already carved into the dirt. That was the trap no one names. This place doesn't punish resistance. It rewards surrender. And standing there, lungs burning, legs trembling, I understood how something could walk here all night and never leave a trace. Because by morning, it won't be leaving. It would be continuing. The realization didn't come all at once. It surfaced slowly, the way exhaustion creeps in before collapse. I was no longer setting my pace. That fact settled into me with a quiet certainty that made my stomach drop. My steps were still mine. I could see my boots rise and fall, but the timing between them no longer belonged to me. Something else was holding the count, and my body had begun to follow it out of necessity. The circle had a tempo, not fast, not slow, endless. Every correction I made was anticipated. When I leaned left, the ground subtly guided me right. When I tried to pause, my muscles tightened on their own, pulling me forward before my mind could finish the command. It wasn't force, it was alignment. That's when the thought occurred to me, uninvited and unwelcome. I wasn't the first one learning this. The clearing felt practiced, not ancient in the way ruins are ancient, but refined. As if countless nights had worn this behavior smooth, as if the ground had learned exactly how much resistance a human body could offer before cooperation became preferable. The breathing moved again. This time it matched me, not behind, not beside, within. Each inhale aligned with my own, each exhale released at the same moment, close enough that I couldn't tell whether I was hearing it or producing it. My chest tightened with the effort of breathing independently, the simple act suddenly requiring intention. I tried to speak, the sound caught in my throat, unfinished. Not silenced, redirected. My jaw clenched without instruction, muscles refusing to open fully, speech implied interruption. The clearing does not allow interruptions. I began to understand the older stories differently then, not as warnings, but as observations stripped of language. Nothing stays overnight. Nothing rests. Nothing remains. They weren't describing disappearance. They were describing replacement. If something stayed long enough, it didn't leave empty-handed. It left behind a rhythm, a pressure, a way of moving that the ground remembered and repeated. And as I moved, no longer leading, no longer resisting, I felt the frightening shift from participation to continuation. This wasn't possession, it was succession. Recognition is quieter than fear. There is no surge of panic when it happens, no dramatic signal, just a subtle change in how the world responds to you. The way a room feels different once someone else has entered it, even before you see them. The clearing acknowledged me. I felt it first through my feet, The resistance I'd been pushing against, that faint drag, like walking through damp soil, eased, not vanished, just adjusted. The ground no longer tested my steps, it accepted them. That acceptance was worse. My boots landed more clearly now, soles fitting into the path as if it had been waiting for their shape. I wasn't correcting my movement anymore. I was being accommodated. The circle didn't guide me, it anticipated me. That's when I noticed the marks, not footprints, depressions. Shallow impressions pressed into the earth at uneven intervals, some nearly erased, others fresh enough to hold shadow. They weren't arranged in a clean loop. They overlapped, intersected, doubled back, dozens of attempts collapsing into a single, perfected road. People had walked here before me, people who thought they were choosing where to step. The air thickened, carrying a scent that didn't belong to the forest, not rot, not sulfur. Something older and drier, like leather left too long in a closed space, like breath that had nowhere left to go. My shoulders tightened. I realized I'd stopped blinking. Each time my eyes tried to close, a sharp tension flared behind them, not pain, but insistence. Awareness was required. The ground did not want witnesses who missed details. The breathing changed again. This time it wasn't synchronized. It was ahead of me, just slightly, a fraction of a second before my lungs followed, as if my body were responding to a cue already issued, as if the instruction to inhale had been given elsewhere first. I tried to slow my breathing deliberately. The attempt failed. My chest tightened until I allowed the next inhale to come on its own, perfectly timed to match the unseen rhythm guiding it. Relief followed instantly, conditioning my body to comply without protest. That was when I understood the cruelty of the place. It didn't trap you by force, it trained you by comfort. I thought of the animals mentioned in the stories, how dogs refused to enter, how livestock circled the edge and panicked without reason. They weren't afraid of what happened here. They recognized the pattern. The ground shifted subtly beneath me, not moving, not rising, settling, as if it had finalized a decision, as if some internal threshold had been crossed and recorded. The circle tightened, not physically, psychologically. The perimeter of the clearing felt closer now, though I hadn't moved toward it. Trees leaned inward, not bending, simply aligning themselves toward the center like attentive listeners. For the first time since entering, a thought formed clearly and without distortion. If I stopped moving now, the circle would continue without me, and that terrified me more than the idea of being forced to stay. By the ninth stretch of my time in the clearing, movement was no longer my choice. It had become instinct, compelled not by fear, not by sight, but by a pattern older than memory. Each step was measured, deliberate, yet never perfect. The ground had learned to anticipate the smallest shifts in my balance, subtly nudging my body back into alignment whenever deviation occurred. The air thickened further, not with smoke, not with rot, but with pressure, something unnameable pressing in, demanding attention without noise. My ears strained to locate the source, yet there was only the constant hush of motion, as if the earth itself exhaled and expected reciprocation. I found myself pacing the same arcs repeatedly, trying to track my progress. The circle, I realized, was not a place. It was a procedure. A set of instructions the ground issued through muscle and gravity, teaching compliance without speech, attempt to pause and the soil reminded you subtly, tilt of the foot, adjustment of the knee, subtle resistance. The tiniest hesitation became unbearable until movement resumed. Shadows shifted oddly, long and thin at the edges, deeper than they should have been. Trees leaned in ways they obeyed no wind. The faint, dry scent that had brushed my nostrils earlier returned stronger, with something metallic in it. Old iron, blood that had no name, leather tanned by years I could not count. I realized the breathing was no longer mine. It had synchronized beyond perception. My lungs drew air on cue. My heartbeat echoed the rhythm until it was impossible to know where I ended and the clearing began. Then I saw it, subtle depressions forming ahead of me, so shallow I almost dismissed them. But they aligned with the rhythm, with the pace I was now compelled to maintain. Someone or something had walked here in this exact pattern before, and the clearing remembered them, clearing my steps onto theirs, correcting me toward the route they had perfected. I tried to imagine leaving, to step outside the circle, but the edges had dissolved into suggestion. Even the perimeter had rules, invisible, insistent. The longer I moved, the more the clearing claimed me, instructing, teaching, weighing every decision. This wasn't supernatural in the traditional sense. It wasn't chasing or threatening or punishing. It was an authority written into the soil itself, a silent horror that demanded participation, a procedural terror that existed because it had endured for centuries, observed, repeated, refined. And standing there, muscles trembling from constant correction, I understood why those who failed to respect it never left without consequence. Not harm, not destruction, absorption. The clearing doesn't act violently, it acts in persistence. I moved forward again. There was no choice, only compliance, and compliance, I realized, is harder than fear. The 10th phase was different. Up until then, the clearing had been instructive, firm, patient, almost methodical. But something shifted, subtly at first, in the way a teacher's silence changes when a lesson is no longer theoretical. The ground began to test my accuracy. The rhythm I had learned, the spacing of steps, the angle of each turn was no longer enough. Minor deviations that had once been corrected gently were not allowed to continue, just long enough to hurt. When my foot landed half an inch too far inward, the soil softened unexpectedly. My ankle dipped, sending a sharp jolt up my leg, not enough to injure, just enough to warn. When my pace slowed slightly, my calf muscles burned as if I had been walking uphill. Even though the ground remained perfectly flat, correction had become consequence. I focused harder, eyes locked on the space just ahead of my boots, counting without numbers, listening to the internal metronome that had replaced thought. The moment my attention drifted, even briefly, the environment responded. A pressure bloomed behind my sternum, a tightness around my throat, the sensation of being observed from below, not above. The air felt lower, heavier, as though the sky itself had sunk closer to the clearing. Each breath required effort now, but not resistance. It was like breathing inside a closed room that had been sealed for decades, oxygen present but stale with memory. And then came the delay. For the first time, my body completed a step before the instruction arrived. The sensation was wrong in a way that made my stomach twist. My foot landed, weight transferred, and only then did the internal cue register, late, like an echo. The next step corrected itself instinctively, but the damage was done. The circle had noticed. The ground tightened, not physically, structurally. The distance between trees seemed to shorten. Peripheral vision became unreliable, edges smearing slightly whenever I tried to assess how close the perimeter truly was. I became acutely aware of my hands. They were clenched now, fingers curled inward, nails biting into skin. I hadn't chosen that posture. It was defensive, not against attack, but against error. My entire body had shifted into a state of precision, conserving energy, minimizing risk. That's when the thought surfaced, heavy, unwelcome, impossible to ignore. What happens when you get it wrong too many times? The stories never answered that. They only said, nothing rests here, nothing remains still, nothing grows, but procedures have thresholds. I imagined the clearing as something patient but finite, capable of deciding when a participant had failed the process, and the terror wasn't of death, it was a free assignment of being repurposed into the rhythm itself. Another set of instructions embedded into the soil. The breathing around me deepened again, not synchronized, not leading, evaluating. I adjusted my steps carefully, hyper aware now, muscles aching with sustained control. Every successful movement brought relief or reward, every misstep threatened escalation. The clearing wasn't hunting me, it was grading me. And somewhere beneath the surface, I felt the quiet certainty that segment 11 would not be about movement at all. By the next stage, the rhythm had become unbearable, not in a loud, obvious way, but in the subtle, constant pressure that inhabits every thought and muscle. My legs no longer remembered freedom, my mind no longer counted moments, my senses existed solely to obey the silent, invisible curriculum the clearing demanded. The air grew thick, heavy, almost tactile. Every inhalation felt as if it were measured, inspected, judged. My chest rose and fell in tune with something older than memory, something that had taught patience to generations and observers long before I arrived. Yet it was patient in a way that punished inaction, rewarded compliance and whispered consequences without ever forming words. I noticed the shadows again. They weren't just elongated. They moved independently, drifting a fraction too quickly or too slowly across the ground, tracing patterns I could not replicate. When I turned my head, they lagged slightly behind or darted ahead, subtle dissonances that made my eyes ache and my mind strain to reconcile. It wasn't supernatural, it was procedural, precise, deliberate. My boots pressed into the earth, and the marks beneath them seemed to shift slightly. Shallow depressions I had walked into now appeared slightly offset, guiding me toward invisible points, training me through repetition. The more I walked, the less I controlled my movement. The less I resisted, the more I felt the clearing's attention intensify. And the most unsettling part was the quiet invitation to surrender. Not a threat, not a predator, not a ghost, a gentle compulsion to fall into the rhythm, to let my body move in perfect accordance with the invisible instruction. Relief promised itself if I obeyed, but obedience was terrifying. It meant losing the part of yourself that decides where to step, how to breathe, how to move. The clearing didn't destroy identity, it reorganized it, integrating participants into the procedure, leaving no trace of hesitation. The forest beyond the circle continued its ordinary symphony. Owls called, leaves rustled, a distant stream gurgled, but the clearing absorbed none of it. It existed as its own space, a procedural universe separate from the world, alive with expectation, careful, patient, unforgiving. Every sense I possessed screamed for rest, every instinct whispered to turn back, but the circle had already begun to judge me, and I understood what it required wasn't speed, endurance, or fear. It required submission, complete, deliberate, unending participation. And as my mind strayed to keep up with my body's automatic compliance, I realized that this was the final lesson the clearing ever gives in daylight. The next stage, segment 12, would not be about observing or moving. It would be about confronting what happens when the pattern becomes more than instruction, when it becomes expectation itself. The moment the final lesson began, I understood why no one ever described what happens next. Language stops being useful here. The clearing no longer required my movement. That was my first mistake I nearly celebrated. My legs slowed on their own, muscles trembling, breath ragged, and ground did not correct me. It waited. The rhythm didn't vanish, it receded, like a tide pulling back before something larger replaces it. The pressure that had guided every step condensed inward, tightening around my center of gravity. I felt heavier without gaining weight, as if the earth beneath me had subtly increased its claim. Then came stillness, not peace, suspension. My boots were planted, but I no longer trusted the idea that I was standing on anything. The soil felt dense, packed, deliberate, less like ground and more like a surface that had learned the exact tolerance of human balance. It knew how much of me it could hold without swallowing. The breathing returned one last time. This time, it wasn't aligned with me. It wasn't ahead of me. It surrounded me. The air moved as if the clearing itself inhaled, drawing something out of the space, not oxygen, not warmth, intention. I became acutely aware of the smallest motions inside my body, the micro adjustments of tendons, the tremor in my calves, the shallow tremble in my hands. Every involuntary correction felt recorded. That's when the realization struck with my terrifying clarity. The test was never whether I could leave. The test was whether the clearing needed to stop me. I remembered the stories again, not the warnings, but the omissions. How people spoke about the devil's tramping ground in negatives. Nothing grows, nothing rests, nothing remains. They never said nothing stays, because things do stay, just not as they arrived. The ground beneath my feet warmed slightly, just enough to be noticeable, not heat, familiarity, like a surface that had been in contact with the body for a very long time and remembered the shape. I felt the urge to step away. My body did not respond, not paralysis, permission withdrawn. The clearing didn't restrain me. It simply no longer acknowledged the concept of departure. Movement without instruction felt foreign now, unsupported, like trying to walk without gravity. And then, mercifully, cruelly, the rhythm returned, not as guidance, as inheritance. I understood then what the tramping ground truly was. Not a curse, not a haunting, not a demon's path burned into the soil. It was a continuity, a place where movement outlived movers, where patterns accumulated, where the ground leaned from every participant and refined itself accordingly, where the land did not punish intrusion, it absorbed contribution. The final instruction arrived without sensation. Leave, carrying the rhythm with you, or remain and become part of it. I don't remember choosing. I remembered the forest suddenly feeling wrong beyond the circle, too loose, too unstructured. My steps outside the clearing felt uncertain, unsupported, as if the world no longer knew how to hold me properly. I walked away before dawn, but even now, even as I speak, I feel it. In the timing of my breath, in the way my feet land when I'm tired, in the unbearable discomfort of standing still for too long. Some nights when I wake suddenly, I swear the ground beneath my bed is counting, and I understand, finally, why the devil's tramping ground is never silent. It is still walking, and so am I.